And de Valera's partial success with some extreme Republicans was further confirmed when, in 1938, he negotiated the return from Britain of those Irish ports in which Britain had retained garrison rights under the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Malcolm MacDonald was then Dominion Secretary.
I thought that if we retained our right to use them, and did use them in a neutral Ireland in case of war, this would make Irish public opinion blow up against us, and they would join the war against us. And indeed, Germany could invade Ireland as an ally of Ireland and attack us. And so, thinking it all over, I thought that on balance, it would be prudent if we could get a proper agreement on everything else to give up our right to use the ports. And if I may say so, this view was shared by the 3 chiefs of staff of the Army, Navy, and Air Force at the time, and therefore I made that recommendation to the Cabinet.
Spike Island and the adjoining Cork Harbour defences have been handed over to the custody of Ireland. This is the first stage in pursuance of the defence provisions of the agreement between the British government and Mr. de Valera. Amid scenes of the utmost friendliness, the British troops departed on a tender for the motor vessel that was to take them to Fishguard. Mr. de Valera arrived at Spike in a launch and made an inspection of a guard of honour. And so the defence of Cork, after 150 years, passes into the keeping of its native land.
But 6 counties of Ireland were still British. In Britain, in 1939, the IRA started a bombing campaign against Irish partition. In Coventry, 5 people were killed, nearly 100 injured. By the end of 1939, Britain was at war with Germany. An hour of danger, which was, by Irish Republican tradition, once again Ireland's opportunity.
Signs of the times. A mass meeting on College Green, Dublin, is addressed by the antagonists of yesterday.
De Valera took the opportunity to assert unequivocally Ireland's neutrality. He was joined in this by William Cosgrave, his old opponent. De Valera could now assert officially that sense of quite separate Irish nationality, which reservists were now called up to defend, and to which he'd been working his way towards for Ireland in the 18 years since the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Reservists were there to repel any aggressor.
No, we were in no position to enter into a war at all, and the only other option open to us was to win with the British Army. So that wouldn't be acceptable to the majority of the people, and Dev then decided on a neutrality, and that was backed up very firmly by the country.
There was certainly, I think, no desire for the Axis powers to win. But at the same time, there was always, among some of the personnel at any rate, a kind of feeling of gladness when the British in particular would meet with some reverse. I must say that.
In 1940, however, Malcolm MacDonald was again involved in negotiations with de Valera in the hope of getting Irish participation in the war.
The British government's final proposals were that they would come out with a statement in principle in favour of a united Ireland, and that added to that statement would be a declaration that a united Ireland would in fact be in existence quite soon in practice. De Valera and his colleagues rejected the proposals. They absolutely trusted the sincerity of British ministers in urging this and saying it could come into operation fairly soon. But they did not trust the Northern Ireland authorities, and they thought that even if the Northern Ireland ministers agreed to sit on the joint committee to work out a constitution for a united Ireland, they wouldn't agree on the constitution, and that the whole thing would break down. And therefore, they said, this is no guarantee that there will be a united Ireland, even later, let alone sooner.
So 26 counties of Ireland remained neutral, and British propaganda vilified this neutrality and Eira's regular army.
The German-style helmet saves them from the embarrassment of looking British. The gallant 7,000 have read that there's a war on. Eire, they declare, will be defended against whoever attacks her. No names, no parachutes. And other volunteers are doing home guard duty. Less to stop 2 million Nazis dropping from the sky than to raise Cain should a British destroyer stray within territorial limits.
In both Britain and Ireland, stories circulated that German U-boats were putting in to refuel at inlets on the west coast of Ireland.
Never did I hear of a case of a U-boat landing anywhere, or taking in arms, or being in any way associated with the country other than buying fish from fishermen. I do know some of the fishermen told me themselves, and when they were miles off Ironmore Head, that sometimes a U-boat would surface and somebody who spoke English would shout to them, "Have you any fish?" And they gave them the fish and they were paid for it.
I know that Churchill had drawn up plans for an invasion of Southern Ireland if necessary. Mind you, he had drawn up plans for all sorts of possibilities, and he was wise in case it became necessary.
There was one night in the very depths of winter, I remember, when the word came that they were going to invade from the north. I was in Athlone at the time, and we turned out our forces and marched to take up position on the border. And it was an awful night, I remember well. The rain was coming down in buckets. But after about, I think we were only absent from barracks for about 2 days when the order came to come back to barrack.
Meanwhile, what of the IRA? They were in secret touch with Germany, and at the beginning of the war in 1939, they'd carried out a sensationally successful raid on the Irish government's principal arms depot at the Magazine Fort in Phoenix Park, Dublin. The IRA got away with 13 lorries and 1 million rounds of ammunition, the bulk of the Irish Army's reserve supplies. This was soon recovered, but it was the last straw for de Valera's government in their attitude to the IRA.
It was the thing that finally made them bestir themselves to deal with it. Up to that, there had been a certain schizophrenic attitude on the part of the government towards the IRA. On the one hand, they were trying to maintain that they couldn't take the law into their own hands, and on the other, they were trying to excuse them for things. And I think this came as a frightful shock to the government.
Soon internment and even execution of IRA men for attacks on the police in Dublin were to follow. A German spy, Hermann Goetz, who came to Ireland for direct contacts with the IRA, as Irish intelligence soon discovered.
When he came down in May 40, he came in one parachute. His radio and communication stuff was in a different parachute. He lost that parachute. The IRA failed to provide him with an effective transmitter for a very long period. They gave him one or two which were hopeless, and it was one of the things that illustrated to him then what he regarded as their complete incompetence.
More executions of IRA men by de Valera's government followed attacks on the police.
Some of those who were executed were people with whom we had been associated during the Civil War, whom we knew. It troubled us certainly very much so. But you see, in the end, it had to be faced up to.
Well, none of us like to see it happen again. I mean, we'd had so much of that in the past that it was obnoxious. But since they wouldn't negotiate, they wouldn't compromise, there was no alternative. Force had to be met by force.
George Plant was a Protestant, and there weren't many Protestants in the Republican movement. And he was very courageous. I remember he gave me a description the night before his execution. I went up to see him, and he gave me a description of what it felt like. He said, it's all right for you people, you were Catholic, you probably believe profoundly in your religion hereafter. I don't know, but I worked for a number of years. I used to work on steel scaffoldings on skyscrapers, building skyscrapers in Chicago. And I often wondered what happened if I fell on one side. Well, now tomorrow morning I'm going to fall off a scaffolding and I don't know what waits for me at the bottom.
So de Valera brought Ireland through the war, having, apparently, broken the IRA.